Out of the dust, he built what no one believed could work. A filter, made from nothing but scraps, to make water drinkable again. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if survival stories of ingenuity and grit touch your soul, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's tale might just outlast this one. The sun hung low over the cracked earth, a slow, merciless burn. Jack Foster wiped the sweat from his brow, eyes squinting against the dust that stirred in the late afternoon wind. Around him, the land stretched empty, barren, a haunting reminder of what had once been. His crops had failed months ago, buried beneath clouds of dust too thick to escape. Now, even the water was running out. The well had dried up first, the earth swallowing its contents as the days wore on. His wife, Ruth, had watched it happen in silence, her hands pressed to her stomach as if holding on to the last shreds of hope. The small creek behind their farmhouse had followed suit, its flow slowed to a trickle until it stopped entirely. In the kitchen, Ruth boiled the last of the rainwater from the barrel. It was faintly brown, thick with the sediment the storm had swept into their home. "We can't keep drinking this, Jack," she said, her voice like the wind soft but carrying the weight of 1,000 silent worries. Jack knew that. The jar he had been filling every night, with what little water they had left now, sat on the table, still and clouded. But Jack was no ordinary man. He'd learned the ways of the land the old ways, and if there was one thing he knew, it was that even in the worst of times, there was always a way. The solution had come to him after a sleepless night spent staring at the barn. The windmill had long stopped turning, the rusty metal blades frozen in place. But the idea still burned in his mind. The water. He had heard of it before, how farmers in the past used makeshift filters during the early droughts. Could it work now, with nothing but the scraps he had in the barn? Could he make water clean again? He left Ruth at the kitchen table, her face shadowed with concern, and walked to the barn. It had been months since he'd been out there, months since he'd looked at anything but the fading crops or the land that refused to give. But today, as the dry wind tugged at his sleeves, he knew it was time. He could feel it in his bones. A simple filter, something born from necessity, could be the difference between survival and death. Jack stood in the barn for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The tools he needed were scattered about: old cloths, rusted nails, broken metal scraps, and an empty water barrel. It was an odd collection, but to Jack, it was everything. He knelt down, examining the bits and pieces as if they could tell him what they were meant for. His fingers brushed over the coarse burlap bags his father had used to store grain in the old days. They had to be the base. The rough fabric would catch the dirt, the dust, the things that shouldn't be there. But that was only the beginning. He needed layers. He grabbed the wool blankets Ruth had left behind after the long winter. They were worn thin, but the fibers would hold. The wool had always been used for warmth, but now it would help filter the dirt. It would trap the larger particles. Jack held the fabric up to the light, inspecting its fibers. They would work. He cut the cloth and began layering it carefully inside the barrel. Each piece, meticulously placed, had its purpose. First, the coarse fabric to catch the biggest debris, then the fine wool to trap the smaller grains of dust. A piece of mesh, the kind used for chicken wire, would help hold it all together. Jack's hands moved with purpose now. A quiet rhythm in the barn that contrasted sharply with the storm of dust that raged outside. Hours passed, and Jack worked without pause. He could feel the weight of the land pressing against him, the unrelenting dust, but there was no time for weakness. Ruth needed the water, and he needed this to work. When he was done, the filter stood before him, crude, imperfect, but with purpose. He filled the top of the barrel with the last bit of muddy creek water they had, watching the slow trickle as it worked its way down through the layers. His fingers pressed against the metal base of the barrel, guiding the flow, coaxing it along. The first drops of clean water began to collect in the jar below, clear, almost unreal in its purity. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The water was drinkable. For the first time in days, there was hope in that jar, and with it, the chance to survive another day. He wiped his hands on his worn pants and stood up. The wind had begun to pick up again outside, but for once, it didn't feel like the wind that had taken everything away. It felt like the wind that could still bring something back. Turning back toward the house, he carried the jar carefully, each step filled with the weight of a promise kept. Tomorrow, they would do it again. And the next day, and the next. Because that was what surviving in this land meant, finding ways to live when it seemed impossible. The water filtered through, clear and steady, a constant reminder that even in the harshest moments, survival was still possible. Jack watched the jar fill slowly, the murky creek water becoming something drinkable, something real. Ruth had been skeptical when he first spoke of it, but now, with the water flowing clean and steady, she stood by the table, her hands clasped in silent wonder. "That's something, Jack," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, as if she feared speaking too loudly would break the fragile hope that hung in the air. She had always been the one who kept quiet during moments like this, never wanting to tempt fate by speaking of hope before it was proven true. Jack didn't answer right, but away. Instead, he wiped the sweat from his brow and set the jar on the table, watching the water settle. The filter worked better than he had imagined, but Jack knew this was only the first step. This was just one jar, just a drop in the vast ocean of need that stretched out before them. "We can make it work," he finally said, more to himself than Ruth. The words had weight, a quiet conviction in them that came from years of watching nature bend men to its will. He had seen it before, the endless cycle of rain and drought, feast and famine. But this wasn't just a drought. This was a storm that had lasted for years, a relentless hunger that had eaten the land from the inside out. Ruth placed a hand on his arm, and Jack looked up. Her eyes, tired but steady, met his. "What's the next step?" Jack hesitated for a moment. He had the filter working, but what about the future? What about the next storm, the next drought? What about the cattle that had already died and the land that refused to yield its bounty? He needed more water, more survival, more life to hold on to. He needed to make this work, not just for them, but for anyone who might be struggling in the same desolation. "We build another," Jack said. "Maybe more, and we teach people how to use it. If this works, maybe it's something we can share." The wind howled outside, but inside the small house there was warmth now. Jack could feel the energy shift in Ruth's gaze, something he hadn't seen in weeks. There was a quiet hope, fragile yet real. "We'll do it together, Jack, one step at a time." And for the first time in a long while, Jack believed it. Days passed, and with each one, Jack's filter became more than just an idea. It became a symbol, a lifeline that people began to talk about in hushed voices. Word spread slowly at first. One neighbor, then two, then more, until it seemed everyone in the small community had heard of the farmer who had found a way to make mud drinkable again. By the time the second storm blew in, a thin layer of snow already covering the cracked earth, Jack had built 3 more filters. They were crude, each one slightly different, but they all worked. Water began to flow into jars from the dirt-ridden creek, clear and cool. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep people alive. One evening, just as the storm grew violent and the wind rattled the windows, a knock came at the door. Jack opened it to find Peter Johnson, a neighbor from 3 miles down the road, standing with his family in tow. "We heard about the water, Jack," Peter said, his voice tight with the weight of the months that had passed without rain. "We've been waiting on the trains, but they're not coming, and the well's dry. Can we use your filter just for a few days?" Jack hesitated. His first instinct was to protect what they had to hold on to, the small bit of security they had created. But then he saw Ruth behind him, standing in the doorway, and she was already stepping forward. "Of course," Ruth said, her voice soft but firm. "We have enough. You can take the next one. We'll manage." Jack stared at his wife for a long moment. There were days when the weight of the land seemed too much to bear, when every corner of the house felt like it was closing in on him. But in moments like these, when the wind howled and the earth threatened to swallow them whole, there was a quiet strength in Ruth's voice, in her simple act of giving. The Johnsons moved inside, their cold faces softened by the warmth of the house. Jack pulled another jar from the shelf and poured it carefully into the filter, watching the clean water collect. It wasn't just water anymore, it was survival. As the family settled around the fire, Jack sat at the table with Ruth, the weight of the storm pressing in from every side. But inside, there was warmth. It was a small comfort, but it was enough for now. They had each other. They had the water, and in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. Ruth placed a hand on Jack's, squeezing it gently. The fire crackled quietly, the wind outside howling like a distant memory. The cabin was full now, filled with the quiet strength of giving, of survival, and of life, still flickering against the odds. The storm had passed, but the land was still haunted by its fury. It had been days since the wind stopped howling, but Jack could feel the sting of its bite in every dry crack of earth beneath his boots. The air, though still, felt thick with the dust that never truly left. Even now, long after the storm had settled, the ground seemed to whisper in the silence the relentless whisper of survival. Jack stood at the edge of the field, looking out over the stretch of land that had once been his livelihood. The crops, once full and green, now lay flattened, dust-caked and lifeless. But the water in the jars had sustained them, sustained the neighbors who had come to him, and even the ones who hadn't. As the days passed, more families came, drawn by word of mouth. They sought the same lifeline Jack had found: water, clear and clean, flowing steadily from the creek's filtered depths. It wasn't enough to replace the land they had lost, or the cattle that had perished under the harshness of the drought. But it was a start. It was a promise. The Johnsons had stayed for 2 weeks, their children's cheeks slowly gaining color as they rested in Jack's warm cabin. Ruth had shared what little food they had, and Jack had shown Peter how to build a filter of his own. The two men had worked together, side by side, in the barn. Every time Jack thought about the water, about how it had come to them, something so simple, yet so vital, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. It wasn't the pride of success or invention, it was the pride of survival. In the end, that's all it had ever been about: surviving another day, finding to another way. The land had taken from them, and yet, somehow, they had taken something back. The days grew colder as the winter approached, and the water continued to flow. Some neighbors had returned to their homes, grateful for the gift of clean water, and others had stayed, making their own homes alongside Jack's. The community, fragile and bruised by the seasons, had begun to rebuild itself in a way Jack hadn't anticipated. It was a quiet revolution, built not from the ground up, but from the small acts of kindness, of invention, of grit. One evening, as Jack sat by the fire, his hand resting on the rough wood of the table, Ruth came to him, her face calm and thoughtful. "What will we do next, Jack?" she asked, her voice steady, but carrying a weight of uncertainty. Jack looked at her, his gaze softening. "We'll keep building. We'll keep going." The fire flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls. The wind had begun to pick up again, but inside the cabin there was warmth. It wasn't just the fire, it was the warmth that came from knowing they weren't alone, that they had found something bigger than survival. They had found each other. Jack stood and walked to the window, looking out into the night. The land stretched far beyond him, dark and empty, but for the first time, it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a challenge that could be met not by force, but by resilience. "We'll be all right, Ruth," Jack said, his voice low but filled with a quiet certainty. She stepped up beside him, her hand brushing against his. They stood there, together, looking out at the vast land that had tested them, that had taken so much, but the land hadn't taken everything. The land would never take the heart of a man who refused to quit.